Okay, let's talk pros and cons of living in Syracuse. I've lived in Syracuse. My family moved here in 1998. I did a little bout in Colorado for a couple years after grad school, and have been in Central New York ever since then. So I've seen all the summers, all the winters here for quite a long time, and I can really summarize this whole video with the pros is that the cost of living is low, and the cons is the weather sucks. So feel free to stick with me till the end. But essentially, everything we're going to talk about here boils down to that. It's way easier to live here, cost of living wise, but you got to put up with some truly horrific weather. So let's get into it here. Pros and cons of living in Syracuse. So, number one, housing is just so much more affordable than the rest of the country. Now, if you look at, I do a lot of talking about median home prices in different areas and all that, and sometimes the data is a little bit different depending on where you pull it from. So for this presentation, I pulled it from Zillow, Redfin, and some of the sites like that. Anytime I'm pulling the specific market data from the MLS, that's where the Central New York MLS covers more than just the Syracuse area or even just the greater Syracuse metro. Kind of goes all the way up to Oswego and Mexico, New York, and it goes all the way down to Cortland. So it is covering Central New York as a big block. Whereas a lot of times, like Zillow, Redfin, they're taking the city of Syracuse and then the Syracuse metro. So all these numbers are directionally correct. It's just a matter of exactly which data set you're using when you're talking about this. So the median home sale price of $235,000 is slightly lower because it's heavily weighting the city itself versus the suburbs. When we're doing the MLS data for all of Central New York, that's going to cover more of the suburbs and kind of the pseudo-rural and rural areas as well, which have higher home value. So anyway, all that being said, a 235, even if we're using 270, which was the median for the month of October, that is still just so much lower than the median home sale price of 410 nationally. And just that mortgage payment, that median mortgage payment of 1686 is just so much more affordable. And that's even with higher property taxes. So you're going to see one of the cons that we get into here is that we have higher property taxes than most of the country. But even with those higher property taxes, since it's on a lower value property, they're not as impactful as they would be if you had that same tax rate on more expensive homes. So if we took the Central New York tax rate and applied it to DC, the taxes would be astronomical. But since they are on lower value homes here, even with that higher tax rate, the monthly home ownership costs are still just so much lower. And then home insurance is way cheaper than most of the country. And that is one of the cons I'm going to talk about is obviously the weather. But one of the pros is the climate, in that we don't really have big climate events. So we get blizzards, but blizzards are pretty much just like, maybe the power goes out, although that is even relatively uncommon. It's mostly just you have to stay home, or it's treacherous on the roadways. We don't get hurricanes, we don't get tornadoes, we don't get earthquakes, we don't get major flooding, we don't get wildfires. Kind of all the things that you always read about in the news that other areas of the country are dealing with are just not problems we have. So as a result, home insurance is just so much cheaper. And that also is just helping with those higher property taxes is the lower insurance value, because property taxes and insurance are money that you're not putting towards your house. So it's not going on principal and it's not going on interest. Essentially, those are just added fees on top. So the property taxes being high is a bummer, but you're saving some on the other end with the insurance. So on average, we're looking at 38% cheaper than most of the country, with $1,000 a month, over $1,000 a month in monthly savings, and 12,000 a year in annual savings. So it really is achievable to purchase a home in the Syracuse area for first-time home buyers. It's just way easier around here than it is in most of the country. I have tons of clients who are in their early to mid 20s, and they are buying decent houses. They're buying nice starter houses. And that is just not, that's not doable in most places. So the housing is really the thing that drives the affordability more than anything else. Now, part of what we're going to talk about is Syracuse relative to the national average. But then the other thing to consider is just Syracuse relative to the rest of the Northeast. Because the Northeast does have some very expensive cost of living areas. So, the national average is also going to include like the South and the Southwest, which do have more affordable areas than the Northeast, Philadelphia, New York City, DC, Boston, some very, very high cost of living areas in the Northeast. So part of what we're going to talk about is relative to the national average, and part of what we're going to talk about is relative to the rest of the Northeast. So The thing that costs less by far and drives the affordability is the housing. That's everyone in the country. That's their number one budget item. Their most expensive budget item is where are they going to live. And here you can do that way easier than you can almost anywhere else in the country. So things that cost more is childcare is above the national average. Now it is well below the Northeast average, right? So, and that's kind of a New York Northeast thing where childcare is more expensive around here. And in the Northeast in general. So it is going to be higher than the national average, but it's going to be lower than the rest of the Northeast. So if you're already in the Northeast, you're not going to see an increase in childcare costs. And that's the same with dining out is another thing. And groceries in general may be slightly higher than the rest of the country, but it's going to be lower than most of the Northeast. So just things to consider there. And then transportation. Since Syracuse is not at all a walkable city, you just have to have a car essentially. I don't know many people who can get around without a car. I have family who live in DC, and it's not really a problem getting around, on a bike or whatever. But in Syracuse, you just have to have a car. Utilities are a bit higher, and that's because you're asking a lot of your furnace in the winter. Now, conversely, you're not asking as much of your AC in the summer. So like if you live in Arizona. And it's 110 degrees, and you're trying to cool it down to 67. That's kind of the same problem, just in reverse. So utilities are slightly higher here, but again, it's not anything crazy. But yeah, so the net result is just it's incredibly affordable, and that is by far, when I have clients who are relocating, it is very often because of the cost of living. If you work remote, your down payment on a house in whatever Salt Lake City, Utah, buys you a house in cash here. So if you work remote and you don't mind the winter, Syracuse is a great option. Okay, and we already talked about this. So again, a lot of the things that cost more are going to be relative to the national averages, but they're still going to be lower than most of the Northeast. So it's a uniquely affordable city, both nationally and relative to other cities in the Northeast that tends to be a high cost of living area. Okay, then job growth here. So since the 70s, Syracuse and the Rust Belt in general has kind of been declining, both in population and value and jobs and all that. And then kind of the big kahuna here is Micron, right? So this is a $100 billion project. And I say it all the time, I'll just repeat it. The GDP of the Syracuse Metro is about $50 billion. This Micron project is $50 to $100 billion. So we are doubling or tripling the GDP of Syracuse with one single project. So obviously the job growth and just the economic transformation that we can expect, when you pump that much economic activity into a relatively small, low population area, it's going to impact everything. However, it's not just Micron. So healthcare is huge around here. So Upstate University Hospital is a massive employer around here. And it's a huge both research institution and academic and just a functional hospital. So it really is huge around here. And then there's other hospitals. We've got St. Joe's, we've got Krause. So in healthcare in general, there's a ton of opportunities in healthcare, and we do end up with a lot of nurses, traveling nurses, and people who work in hospitals, running the equipment and just all the surrounding things, outside of working specifically in healthcare, all those supporting fields. And same thing with education. So Syracuse University and Lemoyne University are in Syracuse. And then obviously we have plenty of teachers, and local districts that support the education around the area. So there's a lot of work to be had there. And technology is actually a rapidly growing sector, and a lot of that is because of the cost of living. If you're running a technology company, you don't have to be in Silicon Valley. You can kind of be anywhere now, and so some places are choosing Syracuse because of that cost of living and the affordability. Because the other thing is, if you're in Silicon Valley, you need to be paying your employees dramatically more than if you're stationed in Syracuse. So I have some friends and clients who who work in technology, and they do not have an issue finding work in the Syracuse area. Then manufacturing, which was, the whole Rust Belt in general, through the 70s was a manufacturing hub. And, we've got Lockheed Martin, we've got Carrier, SRC is a big government contractor. And so there have been some pretty substantial investments in the Syracuse area outside of Micron recently. then we have, kind of regional banks and insurance agencies and things like that is relatively common. And then there are government projects, government employees. So in general, there's quite a bit of job availability and job opportunities in Syracuse, and it's only growing with Micron and the associated support that Micron is going to require. So again, now this Micron timeline, I made this presentation right before the news dropped. They backed it up a couple years, so I think the initial fab construction is now scheduled to be done more like 2029, 2030. But again, every project gets delayed, so it appears as though it's a matter of when, not a matter of if. So this, again, $100 billion project. Just keep that in mind. So population growth projections. So expecting a 15 to 20% metro growth by 2035. So that's 10 years from now. That's gonna be a big difference, right? So we've got a net increase of 100,000 to 133,000 new residents. And again, if zero growth happens, we have a housing shortage. That's with no growth. If we have 20% growth, the housing shortage is going to be dramatic, and that's really gonna drive up prices. So really, it's an excellent place for young professionals relocating. It's very family friendly, and then also where Florida was historically a haven for retirement age people. I have plenty of folks who are retirement age moving from Florida to Syracuse because they're done with the hurricanes. So you can get a similar cost of living. Part of the draw of Florida is one, the weather, and then two, the cost of living. You can get a similar cost of living here. So you kind of check that box off, and then you don't have to deal with the hurricanes. Now you do have to deal with the winter, but winter hurricane. I'll let you choose. So new construction ramping up. Now this is all like theoretical. I did a stream not that long ago about how 2025 had the lowest amount of homes built in any time in the last 25 years, with the exception of the COVID pandemic year. So, theoretically, there's 2,000 housing units planned. We're 30,000 housing units short over the next 10 years. So, that home value projection of 4 to 6% annually, I actually think that's relatively conservative, relatively safe, and historically speaking, the cost of housing really is pretty much tied to inflation. Over the last 100 years, it's more like 2 to 3% per year. If you were to look nationally, just this past year we had like double-digit growth, and again, this is all before Micron. So anyway, that 4 to 6% annual growth seems relatively safe, and that really could end up being dramatically higher than that if everything hits right or wrong, depending on your perspective on it. If the Micron project happens on time, it does bring the jobs and the economic impact that we are anticipating. We aren't able to build the homes that we're planning on building. And if the cost of those homes that we are building does not come down, if it continues to be $300 plus dollars per square foot to build housing, it's just really going to have a massive upward pull on median home sale prices. The Route 81 project, I've got to do a stream just on this project alone. So essentially what's happening is they're getting rid of 81 through the city, and then they're just rerouting it to 481. So 481 kind of bends around the city to the east, and that is going to become 81. So anyway, I've got to do a whole thing on that. But there's a lot of infrastructure improvements, which if you live in Syracuse currently, is driving you crazy. But obviously, the long-term plan here is we should have a much easier way around the city in the future. So the commute times. This one is huge. This is such a pro for Syracuse compared to the rest of the country. I forget just how easy it is to get around Syracuse compared to the rest of the country, unless I'm visiting somewhere. So I have some family in Connecticut. I have some in Virginia, DC, in different areas. And I can't believe how much I'm just sitting around doing nothing in traffic when I go almost anywhere else. Syracuse, it is an absolute maximum of 30 minutes to get anywhere in Syracuse. So if you're on the far east side of Syracuse and you need to get to the far west side of Syracuse, it's 30 minutes. I lived in Central Square, which is about 15 or 16 miles north of the city, and I was working, I was a teacher before I was doing real estate, and I was working in Cazenovia, which is like 15 miles southeast of Syracuse. So it was like a 35-mile commute, and I would do it in like 40 minutes. So it is truly unique in how short the commutes are. And so anytime I have a client relocating, I always, I'll say something like, oh, well, like this intersection in particular, like gets a little crazy around rush hour. And it's like, well, that's for me, it gets crazy. For anyone coming from any other place, the commutes here are a total joke. It is way, way, way better than anywhere else. Then the other thing is what you get for your money. So now the houses here, because a lot of them were built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, aren't huge. So the 1,700 square foot as the average size is not massive, but pretty much all houses have basements. There are some that were built on slabs in the 50s and 60s. But most have basements, and so that's great for storage, or many of them are finishable. Now, you do have to be a little bit careful because we do get moisture in the basements, and so you do want to make sure that you've properly mitigated that before you go and finish your basement. But a lot of times, you can even have a half and half where you have one finished area, which maybe make a theater room or a media room or a workout space or, an additional family room, and then you've got your storage and your utilities and your furnace and your hot water heater and all that on the other side. So there's just a lot of flexibility you can do with the basements. It's also very common for us to have garages. Now you need garages because it can, we can get 2 feet of snow overnight, and so unless you really enjoy wiping off your car in the freezing cold in the morning, you're going to want a garage. But good, it's nice that we tend to have them, and so you really can get a lot more house for the money. In Syracuse, especially compared to the rest of the Northeast, where you're talking about apartments, condos, townhouses. Around here, we do have condos and townhouses, but it's very easy to get into, easy being a relative term, very easy to get into a single family home, with a fenced in yard and a basement and storage and all that. It's really affordable. Okay, to the cons. So the weather, that is the problem, is the weather. So the winter is brutal, and it is, it's the snowiest city in America with over 100,000 or more residents. So there's some other smaller places, and even kind of north of the city, what they call the Tug Hill Plateau, gets like comically large amounts of snow. Like it's absurd how much snow they get, when you get 15, 20 miles north of Syracuse. But yeah, so the snow is one thing, but when I lived in Colorado, there was also snow, and it was December to February, and then March hits and it doesn't snow anymore. The real thing with Syracuse is that you're not done when you get to March. The fun is only beginning. So part of it is the winter itself is a bummer, but the winter itself is a bummer in many places. What makes Syracuse uniquely bad weather is the spring or lack thereof. So what always happens is you'll get 1 or 2 days where it's in the 50s in March, and you're like, oh baby, we made it, here we go, here comes the good weather, and then you just get hammered with a blizzard and another 2 feet of snow, in the middle of March, and then it takes 3 weeks to melt, and then you get sleet and one more snowfall in April, and then probably every 5th year we get snow on Mother's Day, so in May. And it goes immediately from that to 90 degrees in June, so we just don't have a spring. We just have like a diet winter. And that is really what makes Syracuse weather uniquely bad compared to the rest of the country. Is there's other places that have bad winters, but our springs are just terrible. I mean, they are really something else. And so, right, I'm recording this on November 12th. Yesterday, November 11th, we got, so around me, it was only 3 or 4 inches, but north of me, it was 8 inches of snow. So it's like 8 inches of snow in November. And just really the thing that gets me is like, so when I walk outside, yesterday and today, it's just like knowing like going outside is going to be an ordeal for a minimum of 6 months, right? For the next 6 months, I can't just walk outside. It's always a problem, so that's the headspace you're in, when that first snowfall hits, in November or hopefully December. But so again, our winters are bad, but it's really our springs that are just absolutely brutal. And yeah, we don't get a lot of sunshine, which is, I mean, that's true of the Pacific Northwest as well. Like, there's other areas. So I mean, if you're really sensitive to getting sun, this is probably not the place for you. But it does make you really appreciate it when you get a nice sunny day. It's you really love it. But yeah, the weather here is just brutal. Yeah, so here's just a little bit of an outline of now at the bottom you see the pleasant season, May to October. May is a bit of a wild card. I would say May is not reliably pleasant. I would say June to October is reliably pleasant. May, like I said, not that infrequently we get snow on Mother's Day. So that's just something to think about. But conversely, our falls are absolutely elite. So our August, September, October, I would take those 3 months in Syracuse over any 3 months anywhere in the country. I mean, it is just absolutely beautiful. It's like in the 70s. It's very often sunny. You don't get a ton of rain. You get enough rain that it's not like the ground isn't like concrete. But you get a lot of sun, and it is it's not that humid, and it is really 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 beautiful for those 3 months. And that really those 3 months kind of make the other nine more bearable and kind of quote unquote worth it. But yeah, that November through May is tough. And then it does get hot. This is what I always complain about when we get to June and July. I'm like, well, why do I have to put up with a 9-month frickin' winter? If summer is also going to be 95 degrees and humid. But 95 degrees and humid is a lot better than, Atlanta or, New Orleans, which is like 105 and 98% humidity. So where our summers are not amazing, it's not like it's 70 degrees in the summer and not humid. It's still a lot better than a lot of the country. And again, our falls are just absolutely wonderful. The property taxes. So this is something that surprises people. When they're calculating their mortgage payment, if you're not careful, and this is where you can't trust Zillow. Zillow doesn't if you go to Zillow and you type in the mortgage calculator, it's not actually pulling from the tax record. It's making assumptions about the tax rate, so that's where you actually have to pull the actual tax record. Which again, feel free to book a call. I can do all this for you. But you need to pull the actual tax record, get the real tax bills, and then plug that into your mortgage calculator. So when I have people relocating, a lot of times they're surprised, where they calculated their mortgage payment at whatever $1,500, and it's actually $1,650 because they didn't realize that the taxes were higher than they were expecting. Then the New York State income tax, New York is a relatively high tax state relative to a lot of other states. So that's just something you put up with when you live in New York, regardless of what part of New York you're in. So the taxes are higher, but again, since the property values are lower, the assessed value is lower. So the net tax burden is not necessarily going to be higher than the rest of the country. It's just as a percentage of the purchase price, it's going to be higher than the rest of the country. Okay. Some other cons. So walkability, it's just not walkable at all. There's a couple neighborhoods that are close. So, there are some downtown condos, Franklin Square, which were industrial buildings that they repurposed into really nice condos. They're really high end. They're pretty expensive, but they are beautiful. And if you live there, then it's walkable. You can go downtown for shows and dinner and things like that. And then Meadowbrook and Sedgwick. There's a few neighborhoods, Strathmore. There's a few neighborhoods that are walkable in the city, but generally speaking, it's really not a walkable city. You kind of have to have a car, and most of what you're doing is in a car. Public transportation is not great either. We do have a bus system, but it's not robust. I don't know many people who use it regularly, and there's no subway, no railway system, nothing like that. So you just have to have a car. That's the long and the short of it. Then lifestyle stuff, we don't have a professional sports team. We do have Syracuse University, so SU is big around here. Most people are Bills fans. You get a few Giants fans sprinkled in. But yeah, so most people are Bills fans, and then SU is big around here. But there's no pro sports team, and then it's just not a big destination for your Taylor Swifts or your Broadway shows, things like that. It's not like Syracuse is one of the cities that they're checking off. So. You do get, like Bill Burr, if you're a comedy fan, Bill Burr's been to the area, so it's not like there's nothing, but it's just not going to be the same as like New York City. It's like there's world-class entertainment every night of the week. Around here, it's like, a couple times a year you get like truly world-class level entertainment. And again, nightlife wise, it's freezing most of the year, so it's, how many people are going out and about at 10 p.m. on January 5th when it's, 2 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Okay, and then here's just, if you're ever interested, this is where I pulled that data from. But, if you're thinking about relocating to the Syracuse area, please feel free to give me a call or text or book a call. I'd be happy to work with you. And till next time.